Women try to commit suicide more than men by a lot, and that's because women are more prone to depression and anxiety than men are. Let me lay out one of the personality differences between men and women, because it's worth understanding. And you might say, well, there can't be personality differences between men and women because that's anti-feminist. It's like, no, it's not. We might have to actually understand that there are differences between men and women so that we can let men and women make the choices they're going to make without subjecting them to undue manipulation. Okay, so one of the reliable differences between men and women cross-culturally is that men are more aggressive than women. Now, what's the evidence for that? Here's one piece of evidence. There are 10 times as many men in prison. Now, what's that, a sociocultural construct? It's like, no, it's not a sociocultural construct. Okay, here's another piece of data. Women try to commit suicide more than men by a lot, and that's because women are more prone to depression and anxiety than men are. And there's reason for that, and that's cross-culturally true as well. They're more likely to try to commit suicide, but men are way more likely to actually commit suicide. Why? Because they're more aggressive, so they use lethal means. Okay, so now the question is, how much more aggressive are men than women? And the answer is, not very much. So the claim that men and women are more the same than different is actually true, but this is where you have to know something about statistics to actually understand the way the world works, instead of just applying your a priori ideological presupposition to things that are too complex to fit in that rubric. So if you drew two people out of a crowd, one man and one woman, and you had to lay a bet on who was more aggressive, and you bet on the woman, you'd win 40% of the time. Okay, so that's quite a lot. It's not 50% of the time, which would be no differences whatsoever, but it's quite a lot. So there's lots of women who are more aggressive than lots of men. So the curves overlap a lot. So there's way more similarity than difference. And this is along the dimension where there's the most difference, by the way, right? But here's the problem. You can take small differences at the average of a distribution. The distributions move off to the side. And then all the actions at the tail. So here's the situation. You don't care about how aggressive the average person is. It's not that relevant. What you care about is who is the most aggressive person out of 100. You take 100 people and you take the most aggressive person, because that's the person you better watch out for. And what's the gender? Men. Because if you go 3 standard deviations out from the mean on 2 curves that overlap but are slightly disjointed, then you derive an overwhelming preponderance of the overrepresented group. And that's why men are about 10 times more likely to be in prison. It has nothing to do with socialization. So, and then there are other differences too. So it turns out that differences in aggression and agreeableness also predict differences in interest. And so it turns out that men are more interested on average in things than women are, and women are more interested in people on average. And that's actually the biggest difference that's been measured between men and women. It's nothing to do with ability. It has to do with interest. And so the way that manifests itself is that women are more likely to go into disciplines that are characterized by the care of others. And you can tell that by the way occupations are segregating. All you have to do is look at the data for like 15 minutes. Women overwhelmingly dominate healthcare. And that's accelerating, by the way. And men dominate engineering, let's say. And so you say, well, that's sociocultural. No, it's not. And here's the proof. Now what you do, because you want to test this hypothesis, right? It's like, and the other thing that you want to understand is that left-leaning psychologists generated this data. And you think, well, how do you know that? That's easy. There are no right-leaning psychologists.
Except for you.
Well, that's what people say, you know. And so,
I'm on stage with the only one.
And that's been well documented. And so people have published this data despite their ideological proclivities and despite the fact that this is not what they expected to find or what they wanted to find. So what you do now is you stack countries by how egalitarian their social policies are, right? From the least egalitarian to the most. And you say, well, the Scandinavian countries are the most egalitarian. And by the way, if we don't agree on that, then there's no sense having this discussion at all, because we don't agree on what egalitarian means. If you don't think that what the Scandinavians have done has been a move in the direction of egalitarianism, then I have no idea what you mean by egalitarianism. Now, you could say, well, they haven't done it perfectly. It's like, yeah, that's true, but it's not relevant to this argument. So what you do is you stack countries by how egalitarian their social policies are, And then you look at occupational and personality differences between men and women as a function of the country. And what you find is, as the country becomes more egalitarian, the differences between men and women increase. They don't decrease. And so what that means is that the radical social constructionists are wrong. And it's not a few studies with a couple of people done by some half-witted psychologists in some tiny little university. It's population-level studies that have been published in major journals that have been cited by thousands of people. It's not pseudoscience. It's not questioned by mainstream psychometricians and personality theorists. We figured this out back in like 1995. Everyone thought it was settled. And so what's the big problem? Well, who knows what the big problem is? The outcome is not exactly the same between the genders. It's like, well, who says it has to be? And more importantly, and this is something to ask yourself constantly, just who the hell's going to enforce that? And just exactly how are they going to enforce that? And believe me, it's not going to be in some manner that you like, because there are differences between men and women. And if you leave them alone, those differences manifest themselves in different occupational choices. That's the other finding. This is a newer one. As the societies become more egalitarian, the occupational choices between men and women maximize. And what that means is that fewer and fewer women go into the STEM fields. Now, no one wanted that. No one predicted it. No one was hoping for it. It actually flew in the face of, I would say, the most established psychological theories, because my presupposition certainly was 20 years ago that what would have happened as we made societies more egalitarian would be that men and women would converge. That's not what happened. The biological differences maximized as we eliminated the sociocultural differences. And so maybe you don't like that. It's like, that's fine with me. I didn't say I liked it, but whether or not I like a piece of data has very little bearing on whether or not I'm liable to accept it. You know, I'm trying to look at the damn scientific literature and to draw the conclusions that are necessitated by the data. And then you can say, well, the whole thing is suspect because it's the construction of the patriarchal tyrants who generated the Eurocentric scientific viewpoint. It's like, you want to have that conversation, then go to an activist discipline and have it. Because it's not the sort of conversation that anyone sensible would engage in. So I've never claimed that the differences between men and women are 100% biologically determined. They're biologically influenced. The radical constructionists make the opposite claim. There are no biological differences between men and women. That's so preposterous that it barely even requires an answer. But you might specify it a bit and say, no, there are no biological differences that manifest themselves psychologically. And that's not quite as preposterous, but it's also incorrect. It's obviously the case that all sorts of things about sex roles and gender roles, let's say, are conditioned by sociocultural mechanisms, because human beings are very, very plastic. And so the manner in which those biological differences manifest themselves in a culture is radically influenced by the nature of the culture. But that doesn't mean that the biological influences don't exist. If the biological differences manifest themselves maximally where the sociocultural influences to equalize gender are maximal, then obviously the biological differences are powerful and profound. It's conclusive. So it's taken into account in the data analysis. That's why you stack up the countries by the egalitarian nature of their social policies, is to control for the sociocultural influence. And so, you got to admit, you got to just think it through for a minute. It isn't even that what you would have expected, theoretically, is that the societies that are the least egalitarian would have the biggest differences between men and women, and that as the societies got more and more egalitarian, those differences would get smaller and maybe disappear even. But that isn't what happened. It's exactly the opposite is what happened. They maximized in the most egalitarian societies. Therefore, the social constructionist position, the radical social constructionist position, is wrong. It's wrong. It's been refuted, which is partly why the radical social constructionists have taken the legislative route to impose their viewpoint. So they lost the scientific war, but then we can just attack science. It's like, well, it's science itself that's suspect. It's like, well, then quit using your iPhones. Right?
Questions?
Well, if you're going to have your convictions, man, lay them out in your life. If you think the scientific process is suspect and tyrannical and oppressive and all that, then quit using the products that it produces. You don't get to have your cake and eat it too.